Again, welcome tonight to the Community Advisory Body Orientation Workshop. This is for new and returning members. So the members that were just appointed in July, and then we're required each year to take this training. I am going to let our city manager, Paul Budenhagen, take over the rest of the section of the slides.
Okay, thank you, April. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you all for your service. We very much appreciate it. I'll go through a few slides here and then hand it over to our city attorney. So this, let's see, where are we? So on here, you have the agenda that we'll go through. We'll talk about the city manager form of government, the Brown Act, the Public Relations Act, conflicts of interest, rules of procedures, and then questions at the end. So if it's okay with you all, if you can hold your questions to the end, and then we'll just do them all at once, that'd be helpful. Next slide. April, are you controlling this slides? Okay. The first little section here, section 1, about how the city government works, I'll run through, and then I'll hand it over to our city attorney for the Brown Act. So the next slide is about general law cities. So there's a distinction in how cities are governed between general law cities and charter cities. The city of Emeryville is a general law city, which essentially means that we have to follow, that we're bound to the state's general laws, which you can see here on this slide. It means that essentially charter cities have a little bit more flexibility because they're coming up with their own set of laws. Of course, they have to be compliant with state law, but general law cities follow the state's general law and are typically smaller cities. So in California, there's 482 cities. Of those 482, only 108 are charter cities. The rest are like Emeryville, which is, well, Emeryville is a quasi-charter city, which you'll see in a minute, but essentially for most purposes, we're a general law city. The cities that April and John and I came from, Berkeley and San Francisco, are both charter cities. LA is a charter city. Bigger cities tend to be charter cities, smaller not. Also, the government code authorizes the city manager form of government, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Next slide. So this is the piece of Emeryville's governance that makes us a charter city, is the part that allows us essentially to impose a real property transfer tax. So you have to be a charter city to be able to do that. Emeryville a few years ago passed changed their real property transfer tax structure in a way that allowed for the city to accrue more revenue when properties sell. So if somebody sells an expensive piece of property, whether that's typically a commercial property or an expensive private property, residential property, the city now will collect more than it would have collected prior to becoming a charter city for that purpose. In other respects, though, the powers of the city are like they were, and they're part of the general law powers of the state. Next slide. So here we, in Emeryville, as in most cities in California, has the council manager form of government. And essentially what that means is there's a council composed of 5 city council members. Most of you know our council members. That group as a body creates policies. The policies that they create are left to staff to implement and make happen. So they'll come up with their policy ideas, whatever they might be. Though if they get 3 or more council members to vote on that, and they approve it as a body, then that's giving direction to me, the city manager, and all staff to say, okay, please go forth now and implement this. These policies that we put before you. Staff does a lot of work in between these sessions to make recommendations to council on what they think would be in the best interest of the city. When we look at the financial impacts, when we look at policy impacts, when we look at how it might be, these policies might be enforced, how they might be applied. Staff will put together a big report for council and lay out as many facts as we can. The council members will then have a council meeting, which most of you have been to. And in that council meeting, they'll have debate and discussion. And at the end of it, either they will support a policy and vote to implement it or not. And then, as I said, if they do, it becomes staff's responsibility to implement it. So of all of the staff, only 2 are appointed. That is Mr. Kennedy, our city attorney, and myself, the city manager. The rest of the staff are selected by the city manager and supervised through me as well. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about this. The terms of the city council members are staggered, so that of the 5, there's in even year elections, 3 are up 1 year, and then 2 are up in the next term, the next 4-year term. They're held in even numbered terms. Once the elections happen and the body has been seated, every year they select, the council members themselves select a mayor and a vice mayor. So that typically that'll happen at the start of the next year. We have a slide that shows the different council members and who's the mayor and vice mayor, which you'll see in just a second. Next slide. And there it is. So our mayor is John Bowders, vice mayor is Courtney Welsh, and then on the bottom right you see council member Sukhdeep Kaur. So those 3 council members, all those seats will be up for election in 2024. And if they run, then they can run to get those new seats. Other people can run. So that this upcoming election in 2024 is the 3 are up. And then the 2 newer council members, newer elected council members, Councilmember David Mora and Councilmember Kalima Pryforce, were just elected in the last go round, and their terms don't expire until 2026, at which point both of those 2 seats will be up. Councilmember Kaur's was a little bit of an unusual situation in which Councilmember Medina was elected to that seat. Councilmember Medina then resigned her seat before her term was over. The council went through a process and appointed Councilmember Kaur. And so now she's on that same schedule that Councilmember Medina would have if her term expires in 2024, as I said. Even in all of the council members each get 1 vote. So the mayor here is somewhat of a ceremonial role in that they don't have special powers. They're not elected in a general election. They're elected as a council person, and the responsibility rotates when they select who their mayor will be. Next slide. City departments. So as I said, the staff of the city departments are the ones who implement the policies that the council choices that the council members make. There's about 171 full-time equivalent staff positions budgeted. So around 171 positions. And as you probably know, Emeryville has almost 13,000 residents during the evening, and then during the daytime, that population swells with people who come in to work, probably doubles or maybe even triples. So these are the departments that you have up on the slide in front of you here. We're, as I said, a sort of a small group. We're city manager, city attorney, and city clerk. And there's also an assistant city manager, Pedro Jimenez. The 4 of us are in the old town hall on the west side. And then on the other side are most of the other staff who comprise the departments that are down below. Some of those are internal departments like finance, IT, human resources. They kind of are the backbone that help all the service departments function. And then we have community development, which is at the ECDC site, and childcare, the ECCL and ECDC childcare site. Public Works, who does all of the infrastructure projects, community services, which consists of part of the function is planning, part of it is housing, part of it is economic development. We'll have a brand new director. Most of you probably know Charlie Bryant, who's been the director for 23 years, I think. He's retiring at the end of August. And Chad Smalley, who's the deputy director, will be taking over as director of that department. Then we have our public safety departments, which are police and fire. Most police departments throughout the nation really, but particularly here, are understaffed. I'm pleased that our police department will hopefully, fingers crossed, be fully staffed in the next few months here. We have 41 sworn police officers. And then our fire services, we contract through Alameda County. So the Alameda County Fire Department staffs both Station 34 and 35 over on Hollis and Powell. And we have a contract with them, which actually expires at the end of this coming year, June 30, 2024. And so those are the folks who staff the city and do all of the work that you see happening on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. Is that my last one? Yeah, so that's my last slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our city attorney, Mr. John Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Paul, and nice to meet you all, even though we're still in virtual land. My name is John Kennedy. I've been the Emeryville city attorney for the last year and a half, and I am going to take you through the next 3 sections having to do with the Brown Act, the California Public Records Act, and conflict of interest. If April, if you can do the next slide, we can start in with the Brown Act. So the Brown Act, what is it? It's the state's open meeting laws. So all legislative bodies in the state of California need to comply with the Brown Act. It requires, and the intent of the act is that public agencies' actions are taken openly in front of the public, and deliberations regarding those actions are also conducted openly. All meetings of the legislative body shall be open and public. The public has a right to observe and participate in the conduct of this people's business. Next slide, please. So what that means is that agenda titles, there needs to be a brief description of each item to be considered at a public meeting and acted upon. They need to be posted in advance so people have an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to participate in the public meeting or submit a public comment. The agenda titles do not have to contain everything, but they should have enough information to advise the public of what generally will be discussed at the meeting. And I stated previously, California's open meeting laws require that meetings be open to the public. The public may attend these meetings and may record the meetings. And the public must also be given an opportunity to speak at the meetings. There are generally 2 opportunities for them to do so. One during general public comment, which is a section on the agenda. And the second opportunity is for any item listed on the agenda. So the agenda will have a number of items that will be considered by the legislative body. And the members of the public have the right to comment on each of those items that are listed in the agenda. These meetings must be held within the city limits. The public is provided an opportunity to comment in order to help facilitate a conversation between the public and elected and appointed officials, but there is no obligation by these officials to specifically respond to comments made by the public during public comment. And further, you should also note that non-agenda items that are not listed on the agenda should not be discussed, even though members of the public may wish to speak about things that are not on the legislative body's agenda. Members of that legislative body should refrain from further discussion of those items since they're not on the agenda. They can ask that they be added to the agenda as a future agenda item if they so desire to do so. Next slide, please. All right, legislative bodies. What is a legislative body of a local agency? Under the Brown Act, a legislative body is generally defined as a local government board, commission, committee, or other body, whether permanent or temporary, decision-making or advisory, created by charter, ordinance, resolution, or formal action of a legislative body. These include the standing committees of the City Council and commissions of the City Council. Ad hoc committees are not legislative bodies because they consist of less than a quorum of the City Council and are for limited duration and are task specific. Next slide, please. Meetings. So under the Brown Act, there are two types of meetings that are allowed. There is a regular meeting, which is just your regularly scheduled meetings, or there could be a special meeting that the legislative body wishes to hold. A meeting is defined as any congregation of a majority of the members of that legislative body at the same time and place to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of that legislative body. So if there is a quorum and members want to hear, discuss, or take action on any subject matter that is within their jurisdiction, the Brown Act applies, regardless of whether there's any action taken. During COVID, state law explicitly authorized the City Council and advisory committees to meet remotely, subject to certain findings being made every 30 days. Following the end of the COVID state of emergency, state law authorizes remote meetings subject to certain requirements, and April will discuss those requirements later in this training. Next slide, please. These are some of the pitfalls that you should be aware of regarding the Brown Act and how you can avoid violating the Brown Act. They include serial meetings, emails, retreats and workshops, informal gatherings, and social media, use of social media and blogging. Serial meetings occur when one committee member tells another committee member who tells yet another committee member their thoughts, impressions, or positions on matters within a committee's purview, such that there is a collective concurrence by a majority, and that's majority, of advisory committee meeting members on these matters. This can occur in person, on the telephone, via an intermediary person, or via email. As a result, you should be careful about discussing issues with other members of your legislative body. If someone starts to tell you the positions of your colleagues on various legislative body meeting matters, try to stop them from sharing that information by saying something like, let's talk about this at our next meeting. We really want to be careful that members of legislative bodies are not committing serial meeting violations, so you should be vigilant about those occurrences. In addition, city staff need to be aware about being a conduit for a Brown Act violation. Well-meaning applicants and constituents who act as conduits can land the legislative body member in hot water. The Brown Act governs your conduct, not theirs. So if you're going to be talking about policy matters with city staff and asking them to find out what other legislative body members think about that as well, that's potentially a Brown Act violation. So you should be aware of that and not ask city staff to engage in those kind of discussions and avoid that whenever possible. In addition, you should avoid having members of the public also serving as conduits. Emails that are forwarded to numerous people in a matter of seconds, including a committee member, quorum of a committee member, also can inadvertently lead to a serial meeting. Legislative body members should generally try to avoid discussing anything within your commission's subject matter jurisdiction via email, as your comments could be forwarded to other commissioners without your knowledge. In addition, retreats and workshops, as well as other informal gatherings, while they're authorized under the Brown Act, also present an opportunity for you to communicate and bond with your colleagues, but remember not to discuss the legislative body's business that is pending before your committee, or that may be before your committee's based on the subject matter jurisdiction. The same can be said with social media posts and blogging. You should always remain vigilant against participating in discussions which may violate the Brown Act. Next slide, please. There are some meeting exceptions that you should be aware of. With respect to individual contacts, generally, these are okay to meet individually with one other committee member, unless doing so would constitute a quorum of the committee. But be careful again about a Brown Act serial meeting. You can attend conferences, but please remember not to discuss with your colleagues items that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of your committee. You can attend notice public meetings of other organizations or other city legislative bodies. You can also attend social events, but again, the rule is please avoid discussing items within the subject matter jurisdiction of your legislative body with your fellow legislative body members. Next slide, please. So that was section 2. Now we're going to turn to the California Public Records Act. And I'm just going to go over at a very high level some of the requirements that affect you as a member of a legislative body. Next slide, please. Under state law, the California Public Records Act provides a fundamental right of access to city records two different ways. One is a right for the public to inspect public records, and two, requires the city to promptly make those records available to the public. Agency records, policies, and practices must satisfy both types of public records requirements that the Public Records Act sets forth. Generally, the city has 10 days to respond to a Public Records Act request. So given that tight timeline, if you do get a Public Records Act request, please forward it to city staff as soon as possible. That includes your committee or commission secretary, the city clerk, and any relevant staff member that you're working with on that particular matter. Next slide, please. Public records and personal technology. We want you also to be aware of this requirement in that city officials and employees who use personal technology, i.e. their own cell phones, laptops, iPads, any other personal technology that you use to communicate about public business, those records are also subject to the Public Records Act disclosure requirements. There was a California Supreme Court case in 2017 where residents of San Jose brought an action against the city, mayor, and city council members, asserting that the Public Records Act requires disclosure of their private voicemails, emails, and text messages relating to city business. The California Supreme Court held that when a city employee, and this also extends to city officials, uses a personal account to communicate about the conduct of personal business, the writing may be subject to disclosure. City officials and employees' communications about official agency business is likely subject to disclosure as a public record, even though the individual used their personal email or text message accounts to send the message. Given these requirements, it is advisable that you use a separate email account or technology, if possible, to conduct city business. Certainly a separate email account that you use just for your role as a member of a legislative body would be preferable, so that you avoid blending your personal emails with emails that have to do with city business. So you should again be aware that when you are sending these messages, you are communicating with others and posting as a public official. Next slide, please. So section 4 is the final section that I will be addressing, and that's conflict of interest. There's 2 sets of requirements. There's a Political Reform Act, and there's other provisions of the California Government Code that apply to your role as a public official. Under the Political Reform Act, a public official has a disqualifying conflict of interest in a governmental decision if it is foreseeable that that decision will have a financial impact on his or her personal finances or other financial interests. In such cases, there is a risk of biased decision-making that could sacrifice the public's interest in favor of the official's private financial interests. To avoid actual bias or even the appearance of potential bias, the public official is prohibited from participating in the decision and must recuse themselves from a meeting. With respect to individuals who are attending this training, this rule applies to planning commissioners, housing advisory committee members, and the Public Art Committee, who are all considered public officials under state law. Next slide, please. These are the type of financial interests that might give rise to a conflict for you as a public official. The first is business investments, employment, or management. So any business entity in which the official has an investment of $2,000 or more, in which he or she is a director, officer, partner, trustee, employee, or manager, could give rise to a conflict of interest. Real property investment in which the official has an interest of $2,000 or more, including leaseholds, could give rise. However, month-to-month leases are not considered real property interests. Income, any individual or an entity from which the official has received income or promised income aggregating to $500 or more in the previous 12 months, including the official's community property interest in the income of his or her spouse or registered domestic partner. And then finally, gifts. Any gifts that an individual or an entity that the official has received an aggregate of $520 or more in the previous 12 months is a gift, and also could give rise to a conflict. The official's personal finances, including his or her expenses, income, assets, or liabilities, as well as those of their immediate family. So I know this is a lot to digest. The city attorney's office is here to provide specific advice if you do think you have a conflict of interest and you are a member of one of those 3 committees that I mentioned. You don't have to memorize this today. We just want to flag this as an issue to you, and you could certainly reach out to the city attorney's office if you want to discuss the matter personally. But just be aware that if a decision has a financial impact or effect, you as a public official are disqualified from participating in the governmental decision if the financial impact or effect is foreseeable and the financial impact or effect is significant enough to be considered material. Again, you don't feel like you need to memorize this tonight. You can reach out to the city attorney's office if you have specific questions. Next slide, please. So if you are a public official, and again, you need to be a planning commission member, housing advisory committee member, or a public art committee member, you need to file a Form 700 on an annual basis. This assists in identifying potential financial interests that you might have. It must be filed upon assuming office, upon leaving office, and also annually by April 1st. And again, those are the three legislative bodies that are required to file Form 700. No other advisory body member must file a Form 700. Next slide, please. If you do have a financial interest that gives rise to a conflict of interest, the requirement is that the public official must recuse themselves. To recuse yourself when the agenda item is called, you would state that you must recuse yourself under state law and identify the financial interest involved, such as a project is within 500 feet of your real property. The applicant is a source of income for the public official. That is the basis for the conflict of interest that has arisen. You must leave the room or the Zoom meeting when this occurs, and you can come back after the matter has been deliberated. And note that California courts have construed making a contract broadly to extend to the planning, preliminary discussion, compromising, drawing of plans and specifications, and solicitations of bids that could lead to the formal making of a contract. There is also another wrinkle to this requirement about recusal. So public officials have an absolute duty to recuse themselves. Also under California Government Code Section 1090, members of advisory committees who are financially interested in a contract must abstain from any participation in making of the contract, including giving advice related to the discussion or the decision. Again, this is just intended to be a very broad overview. If you have specific questions about recusal, please feel free to reach out to the city attorney's office for further assistance. Next slide, please. And with that, I turn over the presentation to April.
Thanks, John. All right, so I am going to cover the rules of procedure for local boards, commissions, and committees. You should have received this as an email attachment when Lorraine emailed it out with a reminder for this meeting. We'll also make sure that you receive copies of the Public Records Act and the Brown Act information. Most agencies have rules of procedure. The city council has a rules of procedure that is very similar to what we're going to go over tonight. So what this slide is saying is that the rules of procedure are established by the city council, and they can only be changed by action of the council. The Planning Commission and Housing Advisory Appeals Board have similar rules of procedure, but they are spelled out in and adopted in the municipal code. So theirs are slightly different. These are Emeryville's advisory bodies. What we have is a different structure for different ones. The city council committees are made up of 2 members of the city council. So that doesn't constitute a quorum. They have the Budget and Governance Committee, Community Services Committee, Public Safety Committee, Sustainability Committee, and the Transportation Committee. We've already talked a little bit about the Planning Commission and Housing Advisory and Appeals Board. Again, they're established by ordinance and they aren't subject to these rules. They have their own set of rules that are quite similar. The Community Advisory Committees are what most of you fall under. They're listed here, and then they each have 5 to 9 members. They generally meet monthly. The Brown Act rules apply, as John went through. Their terms vary from 2 to 3 years. And then they have expirations of their terms on June 30th of each year. Definition of advisory is kind of interesting to look at. The advisory committees, they're a structured way for the community to give input through perspectives and study issues and develop recommendations. They provide a chance for public involvement and more in-depth study of topics germane to that particular member group. And sometimes the advisory body members, depending on the advisory body, those members may have more familiarity or expertise in a topic than some of the city council members do, and they can offer interesting recommendations to the council. The recommendations made by an advisory committee are forwarded to the city council, and for anything to be adopted, a majority of the council has to vote approval on that item. This is what some of you have just gone through, the appointment and reappointment process. We make the application available on our website. It is open for 45 days. Applications are also printed and distributed in the agenda packets so that council members and the public have access to those applications. And staff don't make any recommendations for appointment. We just provide all of the applications that were received before the deadline, and then council makes that decision at their meeting. And the applicants are considered and appointed at a city council meeting. Applicants are invited to give a 2 to 3 minute overview of their qualifications and answer council member questions. Incumbents seeking reappointment must complete and submit a new application by the designated deadline. If a current member doesn't submit a new application, they cannot be considered for reappointments. The advisory body members have different designations, and it just simply depends on what the topic of the advisory body covers as to the definitions, the designation definitions that are on there. We try to reach out to a diverse community demographic and feel that a lot of that is covered in the designations that we have. So we have business representatives, we have large business representatives, residents. Most people probably fall under community member is what they are appointed under. And this training that you're attending tonight is mandatory once a year. We offer it within usually a month of the annual June-July appointment process. And so that would be a scheduled vacancy if you were appointed based on a scheduled vacancy. If members are appointed to fill an unscheduled vacancy, they can receive the orientation from generally the secretary to the committee after assuming office, and then attend the workshop the next year when we host it. And again, we're recording this video tonight for the people that could not attend, and we will be posting it. Lorraine will be posting it on YouTube, and she'll send out the link for everyone to access. Something that you'll encounter at meetings, or you may have already if you were reappointed, we have agendas. And the purpose of the agenda is to provide a consistent roadmap for meetings. Agendas help the public decide what they want to speak on and what information is going to be coming through that body in that evening, and what items that they'd like to make public comment on. So each of your agendas will follow a specific format. There's a call to order by the chair of the committee. Roll calls done to determine a quorum. Public comment is taken here, and that is public comments for items that are not on the agenda. And John spoke about this earlier, as this isn't a time to get in a back and forth with the public. These items are not on the agenda and cannot be discussed tonight. But you do have an opportunity later on in the evening to add an item to future agenda items. And what would happen here is that you would get a majority of the committee to agree with you that they'd like a future agenda item on whatever that information was that was brought up in public comments. Action items require a vote by members. Information items are generally just informative in nature, and they allow members to have a back and forth with staff or whoever is presenting, answer questions, and get some more information on the topics. And then at the end of the night, there are some announcements made by members and the city staff, and then the meeting adjourns. The public's right to addressing the advisory body. All public comments should be within the subject matter of the purview of the advisory body. But any person may address the advisory body in the following portions of the agenda. In public comment and during each agenda items, the chair should call for public comment at both those times. Each public comment should be treated the exact same and given the same amount of time to speak. The rules of procedure spell out 3 minutes as the typical time that's given. Written comments are added to the agenda items if they're received in time, or they're read at the meeting when people they submit the online speaker card. So that's 2 different ways that people can contact the advisory body. Attendance. Attendance is important. The advisory body can't conduct business without a quorum, without members present, and without some consistency in their meetings. So it's really important that if you are going to be absent, you contact the secretary to the committee as soon as possible. Absences are based on your term year. So your term year is July 1st through June 30th. And if you exceed the allowable absence threshold, which is 33% of the total meetings scheduled, you're subject to automatic termination. What happens is that first I'll receive an email from the secretary stating that you have been absent for the allotted number of times, and one more absence will result in a termination. So you'll get an email about that. But please contact your secretary if your circumstances have changed. We understand that things happen after you get appointed. You may not have as much time. We'll try and work with you. But in the end, it may just be that you need to resign from the committee and allow someone else to take your place who can attend. And we appreciate that. We'll try and work with you too. All right, teleconferencing. So as some of you remember, once the COVID state of emergency ended in February 2023, advisory body meetings returned to in-person only. This wasn't a choice by the city, but it was a reinstatement of the Brown Act rules. Most advisory bodies now have the ability for virtual public participation and very limited circumstances for members. So what we've used the hybrid meeting type, using the boards, the smart boards, and things like that, is an opportunity for the public to participate virtually. But there are ways that committee members can participate. It's generally not allowed, but there are a few different circumstances where you can. The traditional Brown Act rules, which have always been in place and are still in place, is you can print your address on the agenda. You have to post the address at the location that you're going to be, and you have to allow and be able to provide for public comment. So something like a speakerphone. Most people use this if they're traveling to a hotel room. They feel comfortable opening their hotel door and allowing anybody who would want to give public comment to do it right there in the hall. But that's generally the way that's done. If a quorum needs to be present for any of these circumstances. So if a quorum in the physical location that the meeting is happening, which is within the jurisdiction body boundaries. So again, this is one of those things that you would have to let your secretary know well in advance, because your address has to be posted on the agenda. The other 2 options are under AB 2449. And there is a just cause exception and an emergency circumstances exception. AB 2449 was enacted by the legislature, and it allows for virtual participation for committee members. You must determine if you qualify under either of these provisions. And just cause is defined as a contagious illness, caring for a child, parent, spouse, or a need related to a physical or mental disability. You can use this exception 2 times per year. The other exception is emergency circumstances. And this is defined as a physical or family emergency. And this can only be used up to 20% of the total meetings. Again, with all of these circumstances, there has to be a quorum physically present at the meeting location printed on the agenda. So in any case, these are things that you always would need to coordinate as far in advance with your secretary. I know that sometimes emergency circumstances probably would be the one that is outside your ability to communicate that early. But those are some of the things to take into consideration. The use of emergency circumstances requires approval by the body. And if the exception is not approved, the member will be marked absent. They can join as a member of the public. What to take away from this slide is if you're going to be absent, please let your secretary know as soon as possible. The rules of procedure call for an annual report to be presented to the city council. It's generally in March. The advisory bodies are invited to the council meeting to make the report. And the chair, the designee, will generally do the presentation, but we encourage all members to attend. And it's, again, usually in March or April, and it's aligned with council's consideration of the goals, priorities, and the budgets. And that concludes the rules of procedure. So we are going to take questions on any subjects that was covered this evening. And so if you guys want to use the raise hand feature, I will go ahead and call on you. Beth, I have allowed you to talk.
Thank you. I was just curious about the re-election process of the council members. You said that 3 are up for, I suppose, a campaign in 2024, and 2 are 2025 items, correct? So I was curious, for example, are there term limits for council members? Like, for example, that they can campaign for 2 terms and get off, or so what are the term limits, or are there term limits for council members?
I
Yes,
can
you-
answer that, or Paul, if you want to answer that, that's fine.
Go ahead. No, there's not term limits for the council members. So if they wish to run for election again, that's up to them. And if they were elected, then they could serve.
Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Okay, Amber.
I was just wondering if we have any translation services for any of our meetings. And if a member of the public walked in, how would we respond to them if we weren't able to?
So our agendas state that if you need a special accommodation, that you should get in touch with us as soon as possible. And that's usually at least 72 hours in advance, which is pretty much when we post the agenda. We don't have anybody on call that I know of, and we wouldn't be able to do it that evening, but we would do the best we could to accommodate someone if we got that kind of request.
And then one other question for those members who it is advisable for them to recuse themselves. At the Public Art Committee, it has come up where a member, because of a prior installation, has material information to be answered. And then, so we've kept them in the room to answer those questions, and then asked that they be recused from the vote. Is that the most appropriate way to handle such a situation, or is there another way? Or is that just something to follow up at another time?
Amber, is this a discussion regarding a contract or a grant, or what, in what context did this?
The context would be a recommendation for contract. So
Okay.
the nature of the contract isn't before the body, but it is to proceed with contracting.
So unfortunately, California courts have construed the making of a contract fairly broad to extend to any planning, preliminary discussion, compromising, drawing of plans and specifications, and solicitation of bids that could lead to the formal making of a contract.
Yeah, so we definitely had them recused from the vote. The problem was the need for information regarding, just as we would have any artist ask questions about the proposed work. And normally we are not ever, because of a conflict of interest, buying the work of an artist on the PAC. This situation arose because it was the maintenance and restoration of existing work. I think it's getting into enough specifics that I'll just follow up with you later. And it's
Sounds
in the
good.
past as well, but we'll see how it plays in the future. Thank you.
Okay, Ned.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question about the Brown Act and some of the remote restrictions with the Brown Act. Are there geographic restrictions on if you're allowing public comment at your location? Does it need to be within Emeryville? Does it need to be within California?
So you're saying that you're at a remote location, you've most likely posted your address on the agenda?
Mhm.
Is that the example you're using?
Yes.
No, obviously it would be public comment from people who are in the area that you are. If you've traveled to South Africa and someone is making public comment, it could be a person from there. It doesn't need to be someone who's in the city of Emeryville.
Okay, but just to clarify, like the committee member could do that from somewhere outside of Emeryville.
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any other raised hands. Does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, John Suter, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Righty. The question comes down to the Brown Act's rules for not being able to attend. And it comes down to, does it really apply to advisory committees? It sounds like it's, in other words, as far as having to report days in advance and then having to leave your door open of your hotel room or your bedroom or whatever is going on, so that somebody else would qualify as public. Is that really meaningful for advisory committees? It sounds like it's because the advisory committee member cannot be part of the quorum, from what I understand. Therefore, they're really acting as public. So there really doesn't seem to be any meaningful application of that rule.
So if you use either of the exceptions under AB 2449, or you use the traditional teleconferencing option where you print your address on the agenda, you are part of the quorum. There has to be a quorum of people at the physical location, but you are a voting member of that body for that evening, because you have followed the rules and you have posted, or you followed AB 2449 to be a voting member of that committee for that evening. And the rules do apply to the advisory bodies because that's the way that council adopted the same rules for themselves as they adopted the same rules for advisory bodies as they did for themselves. So the city council has the exact same rules for teleconferencing as the advisory bodies do.
Oh, good. Then it definitely improves the interpretation that I got way back when it was first presented to the city council. Sounded like I said, we still weren't part of the quorum. So now you're saying, yes, if they follow those rules, they will be able to vote. Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Beth, I'm gonna let Steve, since you've already asked a question, I'm gonna let Steve ask his question first.
Sure.
Steve, you can go ahead.
This is Gloria Tanchelev. I'm a member of the Public Art Committee, and I'm trying to wrap my mind around the Brown Act. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, so this means that anything that is within the subject matter of the Public Art Committee cannot be discussed outside of committee meetings. Is this true with another committee member?
Not of a quorum of the committee members on your committee. So I don't know how many committee members are on your committee.
There are 9.
So a quorum would be 5.
Ah, okay.
But you need to be aware of the seriatim meeting restrictions that we discussed earlier about sending emails that get passed on to another committee member, that get passed on to another committee member, or other kinds of discussions in which a quorum of the committee is involved in at some point on a matter that will come before that committee.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Beth, did you have another question?
Yes, I had a second question, my final question.
Go ahead.
Is that, so am I to understand that the 3 committees, the planning committee and the 2 others that have to submit a 700 form, those are the standing committees of the city, I'm assuming, and everyone else are advisory, correct?
Those are the 3 committees where the city has determined that these members are public officials for purposes of the Political Reform Act and need to file Form 700. The city could designate other committees to have that requirement, but those are the 3 at this point that have been designated to file Form 700s.
So that means that the advisory committee members are not public officials, correct? But
The other committee members are not considered public officials for purposes of the Political Reform Act.
all right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, last call for questions. I don't see any more hands. All right. I'd really like to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening for this important training and information. I hope it was helpful. If you have questions, the best person to start with is your committee secretary, but please know that myself and John Kennedy's office are always available to help with questions also. John or Paul, is there anything that you'd like to say?
No, I again want to echo what Paul said. Thank you for your service. You provide a very valuable service to the city of Emeryville, and I just want to commend you on your taking the time to do public service.
Yep, I would just repeat that same point. Thank you all very much. As a relatively new city manager here since January, is one of my goals is to get to each of the committees this year. So I've been to most of them, but still got a couple to get to. But I want to thank you all for your service. It's a really important and valuable aspect of the democratic process here, and we're grateful.
All right, again, thank you for attending. We'll be sending out a link to the video and really appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you.